The Ashenvale name has been whispered for over 2 centuries, not in triumph, but in unease, a name etched into the forgotten corners of America's early past. If you travel through the dense woodlands of western Massachusetts, not far from the crumbling foundations of towns erased by time, you may stumble upon a ruined ancient stone wall, overtaken by ivy, half sunken in the soil. Locals don't linger there. They say the land is cursed, that animals won't graze on it, and that no crops will grow, no matter how rich the soil seems. It's a silence that feels alive, as if something beneath the earth is still watching, and the name tied to this silence is Ashenvale. It is said that the Ashenvale family came to America in the late 1700s, arriving not from England like many settlers, but from a more obscure and secretive origin. Records suggest the Black Forest region of Germany, though some believe they first passed through France under another name before making their way to the New World. What made them different was not wealth, nor title, but an aura. They carried with them not only their possessions, but a reputation. The ship logs from 1791 list their arrival: one Jonathan Ashenvale, his wife Eleanor, and 3 children. Alongside their names, a single notation was scribbled in the margins. By the port clerk, travelers of peculiar manner. Refused blessing from clergy. That phrase would echo through history. Neighbors described them as polite yet distant, always speaking in hushed tones among themselves, rarely mingling with others in the settlement. The father, Jonathan, was educated far beyond what was common in those days. He was fluent in Latin, German, and Greek, and carried a collection of rare books whose bindings bore symbols no one could interpret. Some said he had studied under secret societies in Europe, or that he was fleeing accusations of heresy. His wife, Eleanor, was remembered as unnervingly calm, her eyes steady, her hands always clasped as if in constant prayer, and the children. Well, the stories say they seldom played. It began with whispers. Farmers near the Ashenvale homestead claimed their livestock acted strangely whenever the family walked past, cattle refusing to move, dogs whimpering, horses rearing up in panic. The minister of the nearest church noted their absence from Sunday sermons, yet somehow, Jonathan managed to earn respect as a man of knowledge. He offered remedies, poultices, and tinctures to the sick. His cures often worked where others failed, though those who recovered sometimes spoke of strange dreams during their feverish dreams of chanting voices, of endless corridors of stone, of being watched. By the year 1802, the Ashenvale household had grown. More children had been born, though curiously, no one could ever quite agree on how many. Some records say 4, others 6. Neighbors recalled seeing a boy with striking pale eyes one day, and then never again. Perhaps he died, they would say, but no burial was ever recorded. The family's numbers seemed to shift like shadows, always uncertain. The first true sign that something darker lay beneath their quiet life came in the winter of 1803. A child from a neighboring farm disappeared. Search parties combed the frozen woods for days, lanterns casting weak halos of light across the snow. When they finally found him, he was alive, but shivering, wandering in a daze near the Ashenvale property line. He spoke of a basement with walls that whispered, of faces that weren't faces, and of a woman's voice promising that he would never be alone again. The child's account was dismissed as fevered imagination brought on by exposure. Yet, in the months following, more oddities surfaced: unmarked fires in the woods at night, strange symbols carved into trees, and always, the Ashenvale family seen nearby, their pale faces illuminated by the glow. A journal entry dated March 1804 from Reverend Nathaniel Carter survives to this day in the archives of a local historical society. It reads, "They are not of God, they speak words not meant for the living. I fear they seek not heaven, nor the Lord's mercy, but some darker promise. The wife's eyes haunt me, for she looks not with malice, but with pity, as though we are blind to something. She clearly beholds. May the Lord protect us from whatever it is they serve." The Reverend would be found dead less than a year later, his body discovered in the woods with his Bible torn to shreds around him. His death was ruled as an attack by wolves, though curiously, his flesh bore no bite marks, only long, deliberate incisions. The Ashenvale legacy deepened into rumor, into dread, and into silence. Settlers who moved into the valley after them avoided the family, yet none dared confront them directly. When children asked about the Ashenvales, parents hushed them. When travelers passed by the homestead, they quickened their steps. It became a rule spoken quietly but firmly: do not cross their land at night. And yet, there are always those who cannot resist curiosity. In 1811, 3 young men from a nearby town dared to creep toward the Ashenvale house under the cover of darkness. Only one returned. His testimony was barely coherent, but fragments remain in the court transcript where he was questioned. Not a house, a temple. They were beneath the earth, chanting, "They cut the lamb and drank. Not like wine, but like they needed it." Faces in the stone. They looked back at me. He died of what doctors then called brain fever less than a week later. By the early 19th century, the Ashenvale estate had transformed. No longer just a homestead, it had expanded into a compound. Visitors spoke of a large wooden hall being erected, though no builders were ever seen at work. Windows were shuttered at all hours. Smoke rose from chimneys day and night, and faint vibrations could be felt in the ground near their land, as if something vast and hidden stirred beneath. No official records tell us what rituals or practices the Ashenvale family engaged in, but scraps of testimony, diaries, and oral histories pieced together a picture both disturbing and unshakable. They were not merely a family, they had become a congregation, a cult hidden in plain sight, growing in silence. With its own rules, its own faith, and its own sacrifices, what they worshipped remains the greatest mystery. Some call it an old-world demon carried with them across the ocean. Others say it was not a god at all, but something ancient buried in the earth long before men walked on it. Whatever the truth, the Ashenvales left behind more than just ruins. They left behind a legacy of fear that still lingers in the soil of Massachusetts, in the burned-out stumps of their compound, and in the nightmares of those who dare to read too deeply into their story. And tonight, we will descend into that darkness together. We will peel back the layers of history, testimony, and rumor, to uncover the macabre truth of the Ashenvale family, a truth that perhaps was never meant to be spoken. Because the question that still hangs 200 years later is this: did the Ashenvales vanish? Or are they still here, watching, waiting, in the shadows where faith and horror intertwine? To understand the Ashenvale family, we must first step back into the America they inhabited. The early 1800s was a time of deep contradictions. The United States was still young, fragile, struggling to define its own identity. Settlers carved new lives from the wilderness. Towns rose from the forests. And yet, beneath the progress, there was an undercurrent of fear, superstition, and uncertainty. Faith was not just a choice, it was survival. The church anchored communities, and anything that strayed beyond its teachings was cast into shadow. In the valleys of western Massachusetts, isolation was both a blessing and a curse. Vast forests stretched endlessly, filled with sounds that were never entirely familiar. Wolves howled in the distance, owls screeched through the night, and the winds carried voices that could unnerve even the most steadfast farmer. Life was hard, survival uncertain, and the wilderness reminded settlers daily that the line between civilization and chaos was paper-thin. It was in this world that the Ashenvales planted their roots. Their estate stood on the edge of what was once called Coldwater Hollow, a valley marked by dense woods, steep ridges, and mists that clung stubbornly to the earth each morning. The soil was fertile, the river clear, but there was something unsettling about the place. Native tribes who had lived there long before colonists arrived avoided the hollow. Early accounts suggest they spoke of the land as cursed or asleep with a hunger. Whether those stories were warnings lost to translation or simply dismissed as superstition, the settlers ignored them. The Ashenvales did not ignore them, they embraced the hollow, as if the land itself had called them to it. By the early 1800s, America was also in the midst of what historians now call the First Great Awakening, a period of religious revival that swept across towns and villages. Traveling ministers preached fiery sermons about salvation and damnation. Tent revivals brought crowds of thousands, weeping and shaking as they repented of their sins. Yet, for every revival that pulled souls back into the fold of Christianity, there were whispers of countercurrents, small sects, secret gatherings, societies that claimed they sought a purer truth hidden behind the veil of organized religion. Most were harmless, but some were not. The Ashenvales fell into the latter. They never attended revival meetings. When neighbors asked why, Jonathan would smile and say, "The truth is not found in noise and frenzy, but in silence and listening." His words unsettled people, though few could challenge him openly. He was eloquent, persuasive, and his knowledge of scripture was flawless. Yet the way he twisted its meaning left even the most devout uneasy. He would quote verses, not to reinforce faith, but to undermine it. When asked about the afterlife, he once replied, "The kingdom of God is beneath us, not above us. One must dig to find it." This strange philosophy was not entirely unique. In Europe, societies like the Rosicrucians and remnants of mystical sects from the Reformation era had long speculated about hidden wisdom beneath Scripture. But in the wild frontiers of America, where fear of the unknown ran deep, such words were dangerous. And yet, danger did not seem to touch the Ashenvales. Their farm thrived, while others struggled with crop failures. Their children rarely fell ill in a time when fever and disease took many, when harsh winters froze rivers and starved cattle. Somehow, the Ashenvales endured. People noticed, and envy grew. Some said they had made a pact with dark forces, others that they were blessed by some secret knowledge. Whatever it was, survival came easily to them in a land where survival was meant to be earned through toil and prayer. The architecture of their estate added fuel to suspicion. At first it was a simple wooden house, but by 1810, travelers reported strange addition structures not common to American homesteads. Stone pillars etched with indecipherable marks, A long, narrow hall, with windows so high they admitted no natural view. An underground root cellar that seemed far too vast for mere storage. Local stonemasons insisted they had never been hired to build it, and yet there it stood, solid and ancient-looking, as if pulled from another century. Inside, accounts are even stranger. One peddler, a man named Samuel Wright, claimed he had been invited in for supper during a storm. He later recounted in his letters that the walls of the dining room bore murals, faded, crude paintings of human figures surrounding a black sun. The faces of the figures were distorted, eyeless, their mouths open in silent screams. Wright fled before finishing his meal, convinced he had sat at the table of a foreign faith that spoke not to heaven but to the earth. But the Ashenvales had allies too. Some townsfolk defended them, insisting that their remedies and knowledge saved lives, that they were simply misunderstood intellectuals, persecuted for their difference. And here is where history becomes murky, because for every tale of horror tied to their name, there is also a story of mercy: children cured of fever, injured men healed, women aided during childbirth when no midwife could help. It is as though the family wore two faces, one of compassion, one of dread. The historical setting of Massachusetts at that time also played a role in what came next. The region had already been scarred by the Salem witch trials a century earlier, and though most had moved beyond that hysteria, the memory lingered. Suspicion of outsiders was baked into the soil. Whispers of sorcery, cults, and forbidden rites carried weight even in the most rational minds, and the Ashenvales, whether they intended to or not, fit that mold perfectly. By 1812, tensions in the valley were at a breaking point. The War of 1812 raged elsewhere, but here in Coldwater Hollow, a different kind of war brewed silently. Crops of nearby farms withered while the Ashenvale fields flourished. Livestock disappeared. Bones sometimes found in the woods, stripped clean. Lights flickered in the hollow at night. Voices carried on the wind, though no gatherings were ever seen. And then there were the sounds, the low, rhythmic pounding that settlers swore came from beneath the Ashenvale estate, like drums muffled by soiled. One settler, a woman named Mary Ellison, wrote in her diary in July of that year, "At night, I heard them again. It shakes the floorboards of our house, though we are 2 miles from theirs. Thomas says it is nonsense, but I know it is not. It is a beating, steady and slow, as though a heart larger than any beast lies sleeping in the earth." These accounts were not isolated. Multiple diaries, letters, and oral testimonies repeat the same imagery: sounds from beneath, lights in the woods, and the feeling of being watched. The Ashenvales, when confronted, denied nothing but explained nothing either. Jonathan would simply smile and say, "The earth is alive. Perhaps you are only now beginning to hear it." Two settlers trying to cling to faith and survival. Such words were not reassurance, they were terror. And so the Ashenvales became more than a family. They became a symbol. To some, they were harbingers of doom, proof that evil walked among men. To others, they were a puzzle, holding knowledge forbidden to the rest. But to everyone, they were something unnatural. The stage was set. A nation torn between enlightenment and superstition. A valley haunted by whispers. And at its center, the Ashenvale family, whose history was only beginning to stain the soil with fear. Asterisk, when you peel back the veil of legend and rumor, what remains of the Ashenvale family are fragments, scattered across court records, letters, and fading testimonies. But those fragments form unsettling portraits of a family that seemed at once human and inhuman, familiar and yet alien to those who lived beside them. To understand the macabre history of the Ashenvales, we must look at them not only as a collective, but as individuals, each bearing a role in what would later be described as a congregation of shadows. At the head stood Jonathan Ashenvale, born, it is said, in 1761 in the Black Forest region of Germany, though this too is uncertain. His baptismal record survives only in fragments, with his surname scratched out and overwritten. Some historians believe his family name was originally Escalation, meaning Ash Valley, later anglicized when they fled to France and then to America. What cannot be disputed is his education. He possessed knowledge far beyond what was typical for a man of his origins. His library, later catalogued after the estate's collapse, included volumes in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. He had copies of medical treatises alongside works of natural philosophy. But within those shelves, there were also stranger tomes, one written entirely in cipher, another in what appears to be runes no scholar has successfully translated. Jonathan was remembered by neighbors as soft-spoken, but with a voice that lingered. One farmer described him as a man who could say the plainest words, yet they sank into your chest as though they were more than words. He was not a large man, but his presence filled any room he entered. In his face, people noted something unnerving, not cruelty, not malice, but distance, as though his eyes, gray and unblinking, were fixed on something far beyond whoever stood before him. His wife, Eleanor, was of a different nature altogether. Born in 1767, she was remembered as beautiful in a way that unsettled more than it charmed. Her complexion was pale, her dark hair always tied back, her posture perfect. Women in the valley whispered that she never seemed to age, that her face remained unchanged over decades while others grew lined and weary. What drew the most attention was her calmness. Even in the midst of storms, sickness, or conflict, Eleanor never raised her voice, never faltered. She moved through life with an eerie serenity, as though she lived in a world separate from everyone else. A diary entry from 1813 by Martha Green, who worked briefly as a maid for the Ashenvales, describes Eleanor in detail. She spoke kindly to me, yet her eyes never warmed. They were fixed, like glass, as if she saw something behind me at all times. She prayed, but not as we pray. No folded hands, no words. She only closed her eyes, lips parted, as though listening. Once, I passed by her chamber late at night and heard her speaking in a language I did not know. It was low and flowing, not harsh like German, nor sweet like French. It was older, slower, as though the words themselves resisted the air. It is Eleanor who is most often tied to the rituals later attributed to the family, neighbors claimed. They saw her leading processions through the woods, always carrying a lantern, always humming the same low melody that children would later describe as a lullaby that made them feel sick. Some called her the true heart of the cult, the one who bound the family together. Jonathan may have been the voice, but Eleanor was the will dot, and then there were the children. Their names appear in fragments, scattered inconsistently. A daughter, named Abigail, a son named Matthias, another boy called Jonas in one account, and Isaac in another. What unsettles historians is the inconsistency of the records. Census documents from 1800 list 3 children. By 1810, 6 are listed, yet by 1820, only 4 remain, without any mention of deaths or burials. Neighbors swore they saw children playing in the yard who were never named, and then never seen again. One traveler even claimed the number of children seemed to change. By the day, there were 5 at breakfast, and by dusk only 3. Those who remembered them spoke of their silence. Unlike most children, they rarely laughed or shouted. They moved in strange synchronization, as though they were always listening for a hidden cue. Their eyes, some said, were pale to the point of translucence, reflecting light unnaturally in the dark. Abigail, the eldest, was noted for her singing voice. At church gatherings, when she did attend, she would sing hymns in a pitch so high it unsettled the congregation, though none could deny it was beautiful. Matthias, the second-born, had a cruel streak. Local boys who crossed him spoke of waking up with scratches across their doors, of whispers in the night that seemed to mimic his voice. Perhaps most disturbing were accounts of the younger children. Neighbors swore they never saw them in daylight, only at dusk or dawn, hovering near the edges of the woods. Some thought they were sickly, others thought they were simply shy. But when asked, the Ashenvales would give no answers. Once, when pressed, Jonathan simply said, "Not all children are meant for the world as you know it." Beyond the family itself, there were other figures historians cannot fully place, but who seem to have gravitated toward the Ashenvale estate. Strangers from out of town, men in plain black coats who stayed for weeks and then vanished. Women who arrived with children and left without them. A drifter whose body was later found on the riverbank, his chest marked with symbols carved into his skin, the same marks seen on the stone pillars outside the Ashenvale Hall. Together, these fragments paint a picture of a family that was not merely blood, but congregation. Jonathan as the scholar and prophet, Eleanor as the silent priestess, their children as both heirs and sacrifices, and the stranger's followers drawn like moths to a flame, bound into whatever faith the Ashenvales served. There is one testimony, rarely cited but perhaps the most chilling, from a woman named Sarah Pritchard who lived 3 miles from the estate. In 1815, she reported to local authorities that she had been woken in the night by a knock at her door. Standing there was one of the Ashenvale children, she could not say which, holding a candle. The child said only this, "Mother says that Earth is ready now," then turned and walked back into the darkness. Sarah packed her belongings the next day and fled the valley with her family. Her descendants never returned. When pieced together, the Ashenvales become less a family and more a structure, a hierarchy of roles built to serve something beyond themselves. Whether that was a god, a spirit, or an invention of their own making, remains unclear. But the consistency of witness accounts suggests that the Ashenvales did not act aimlessly. Their lives were orchestrated, ritualized, as though every step they took, every word they spoke, was part of a design. And that design, whatever it was, would soon escalate beyond whispers and shadows, into acts that could no longer be ignored. Asterisk by 1816. The Ashenvales were no longer a quiet curiosity whispered about in Coldwater Hollow. They had become a shadow that pressed against every cabin wall, a presence that seemed to linger in the valley's air itself. What began as rumors of odd behavior, strange prayers, and inexplicable knowledge soon escalated into a sequence of events, so disturbing that even the most rational settlers began to doubt the world they lived in. The first escalation was such unease that spread through livestock and children. Farmers complained their cattle grew restless at night. kicking stalls, refusing food, staring into the woods as though something unseen moved there. Children began waking from nightmares, often describing the same vision: a tall woman holding a lantern, standing at the edge of their beds, whispering words they couldn't understand. Mothers tried to soothe them, but the children insisted it was not a dream, that she was truly there. The settlers had little doubt who the woman was meant to be. Eleanor Ashenvale, and then came the voices. On still nights, when the mist settled over the hollow, families swore they could hear chanting carried on the wind. Low, rhythmic, never in English. Sometimes the voices were joined by drums, muffled and slow, like a heartbeat beneath the ground. One man, a blacksmith named Elias Turner, followed the sound one evening, determined to confront the family. He returned the next morning pale and silent, his hair gone white in patches. When pressed, he muttered only, "They were beneath. They are always beneath." He left the valley within the week. By midsummer of 1816, disappearances began. At first, it was livestock, sheep, found bloodless in the fields, carcasses arranged in strange circles. Then it was travelers. A merchant passing through was last seen near the Ashenvale estate. His cart was later discovered, abandoned, his goods intact, his body never recovered. More alarming still were the children. In August, 2 siblings, the Dunmore children, vanished while gathering berries in the woods. Their father searched frantically for days until he stumbled upon the edge of the Ashenvale property. There, carved into the bark of a tree, was a symbol he did not recognize, a circle pierced by a vertical line, with small notches radiating outward. The same mark would later be found carved into stone pillars at the Ashenvale compound. Grief turned quickly to rage. The settlers whispered of forming a search party, some even spoke of storming the estate, but fear paralyzed them. For every man who spoke bravely in daylight, the night would steal his courage. And the Ashenvales themselves seemed untouchable. When confronted about the missing children, Jonathan would only shake his head and murmur, "The hollow takes what it requires." The most chilling testimony from this period comes from a girl named Lydia Carter, aged 12, who disappeared in September but was found days later, wandering aimlessly near the riverbank. She was half-starved, her dress torn, her hands smeared with soot. When neighbors carried her home, she muttered fragments of sentences. Lanterns in the ground, singing from the stone. They said, "I belong, but not yet. Not yet." She would not speak of it again, and by the following winter, Lydia fell into a wasting illness and died before her 13th birthday. Her grave marker still stands in the ruins of an abandoned cemetery near Coldwater Hollow. The Escalation reached its peak in the winter of 1817. Diaries from that season record bitter cold, with storms that seemed to strike the valley harder than anywhere else. Yet while cabins froze and barns collapsed, smoke rose constantly from the Ashenvale chimneys. Witnesses claimed they saw lights not only in the windows, but beneath the earth itself flickering, moving as though hundreds of torches lit a cavern. Below, on one moonless night, a group of settlers swore they saw a procession winding down the hill from the estate. Dozens of figures in dark robes, carrying candles, walking in silence toward the woods. At the front walked Eleanor, lantern raised, and beside her, a child whose face none could recognize. Fear boiled into near panic. The townspeople of nearby Deerfield held a gathering in January of 1818, where Reverend Samuel Whitaker urged decisive action. His words, recorded by his son, were grim. "If we allow this family to root further, it will not be only our cattle, nor our children, but our very souls they will harvest." Plans were drawn to confront the Ashenvales, but the timing proved ill-fated. Only days later, tragedy struck the valley in a way none could deny. A fire consumed the Ellison homestead. Mary Ellison, the same woman who had written of hearing the heartbeat in the ground years earlier. Her family perished inside, their bodies later found arranged in a circle around the hearth, untouched by flames, while the house itself was reduced to ash. The blaze had spared their flesh but blackened their eyes, as though burned from within. Locals whispered that it was no ordinary fire, but the work of the Ashenvales, and yet, no proof tied them directly. Jonathan appeared at the funeral, offering condolences, his face grave but his tone calm, almost rehearsed. Witnesses later said his presence felt like mockery. He bowed his head, one wrote, but his eyes glinted as though he were watching a play he had already seen performed. That same winter, more children vanished, 3 in total. No bodies were ever found. By spring, the valley was gripped not only by fear, but by despair. Families began to flee, abandoning farms. Generations had built. Those who remained lived under an unspoken rule: do not wander after dusk, do not look toward the Ashenvale estate, and above all, do not answer if you hear a knock at night. It was also in 1818 that the first true physical evidence of the family's practices emerged. A group of hunters, tracking game near the estate, stumbled upon an underground entrance hidden beneath brush and stone. Inside, they found a chamber walls carved with strange runes, a central pit filled with ashes and bones. Human bones. When the hunters returned with others to show what they had seen, the entrance was gone, sealed as though it had never existed. the discovery shook the valley. For the first time, whispers of the family's rituals became undeniable. The settlers now spoke openly of the Ashenvales as a cult, a congregation not of God, but of something older, darker, and rooted in the very land beneath them. By now, even the authorities began to take notice. In May of 1819, a magistrate from Springfield was petitioned to investigate. But when his men arrived, they reported nothing unusual, only a family of eccentric but peaceful settlers. Whatever they saw, or were told, has been lost to time. But curiously, one of the men resigned his post only weeks later, leaving behind a single note: "There are truths best left in shadow." This marked the turning point. The Ashenvales no longer lurked on the edges of rumor. They were at the heart of a terror that gnawed at the community. Families fled, churches warned of their presence, and yet the family endured, untouched. Their estate thriving amidst decay. It was as though the valley itself had fallen under their spell, and those who remained could feel it tightening. Year by year, a sense that something was building. That all the chanting, the fires, the disappearances, were leading towards something greater, and by 1820, that something would arrive. The storm that had gathered over Ashenvale in the late autumn of 1813 did not come from the sky. It rose instead from the hearts of those who had once whispered prayers to God, but now prayed to something far older and far less merciful. The town's final descent began quietly, as such things always do, not with thunder or sudden fire, but with the slow corrosion of trust and sanity. Neighbors no longer spoke to one another in the street. Families kept their shutters drawn even in daylight, and the church that once stood as the proud centerpiece of the valley now glared like a wound upon the land. Its bell tower silent, its doors bolted from within. Reports trickled out to nearby settlements. Travelers spoke of hearing a low chanting carried on the wind, even from miles away, as though hundreds of voices were reciting words in a language not meant for the human tongue. Farmers who dared to venture too close to Ashenvale swore they saw children walking in lines at night, holding candles, their faces blank and eyes staring forward without blinking. More troubling were the disappearances. By early winter, more than a dozen men, women and children were missing from villages neighboring Ashenvale, their homes found undisturbed, meals still warm upon the table. A meeting was called in the nearby town of Coldwater on December 12, 1813. There, under flickering lamplight, representatives of scattered communities argued fiercely. Some demanded the Church of Ashenvale be burned to the ground and every last soul within purged. Others feared that such an act would awaken something best left dormant, a retribution more terrible than the town already endured. But consensus was reached on one thing: Ashenvale could not be ignored. Whatever had taken root there was growing, and if left unchecked, it would spread. Among those who volunteered to confront the family and their followers was Captain Elias Corwin, a man hardened by war and yet unsettled by whispers of what had transpired in that valley. In his journal, which survives to this day in the Coldwater Historical Society, he wrote, "I fear we march not against men, but against shadows draped in flesh. And though my faith is firm, I cannot shake the thought that we walk into the mouth of hell itself." On the night of January 3, 1814, Corwin led nearly 30 men into Ash, torches in hand, rifles slung across their shoulders. They marched through snow that swallowed their boots, the forest pressing in around them with suffocating silence. Not a bird stirred, not a wolf howled. Even the wind seemed to die as they approached the black silhouette of the Ashenvale Church. The building loomed against the pale winter moon like a sentinel of death. Its windows glowed faintly from within, as though hundreds of candles burned inside, though no sound leaked from its walls. The men forced the heavy doors open, and what they saw has never been recorded in full detail. Perhaps because words could not contain the sight. They found the pews filled with townspeople, every man, woman, and child seated upright, their eyes closed as though in sleep, their mouths moving in perfect unison, whispering a prayer in that same alien language. At the altar stood Father Nathaniel Ashenvale himself, pale and gaunt, his eyes reflecting the firelight like pools of glass. His children flanked him, their hands raised, their faces eerily serene. When Corwin demanded the service be ended, Nathaniel only smiled. Witnesses later recounted that his voice did not echo in the church as a human voice should, but seemed to seep from the very walls. "You arrived too late. The covenant is sealed. Ashenvale belongs not to you, nor to the God you pray to, but to the keeper who waits in silence." The townspeople began to rise from their seats in mechanical unison, their faces slack, their limbs moving as though guided by invisible strings. Panic erupted. Shots were fired. The torches dropped to the floor, igniting the dry wooden beams. Screams filled the sanctuary as flames licked upward, but the chanting only grew louder, more frenzied. Some men swore the flames bent unnaturally, curling inward rather than outward, as if feeding not on wood, but on the very air of the room. Captain Corwin fought his way to the altar, his rifle in one hand and a crucifix in the other. He claimed to have looked into Nathaniel's eyes in that final moment and seen not a man, but something vast and ancient peering back at him, a shadow too immense to belong in flesh. In a desperate act, Corwin hurled his torch upon the altar, setting the very heart of the church ablaze. What happened next is fragmentary, pieced together from scorched pages of Corwin's journal and the rambling testimony of the few who escaped with their lives. Some swore that as the church collapsed, the townspeople inside did not scream in pain, but continued their chant, even as fire consumed their bodies. Others said the building itself seemed to breathe, exhaling one final sigh before imploding. In a storm of ash and sparks, and some whispered of a sound beneath the roar of flames, a voice too deep and resonant to be human, echoing up from the earth itself. By dawn, nothing remained of Ashenvale but smoldering ruins and the blackened skeleton of the church bell tower. Of the 30 men who entered, only 6 returned, each broken in body and spirit. Corwin himself stumbled back to Coldwater weeks later, half-starved and incoherent, muttering fragments of that unholy chant until the day he died. His final entry, written in a trembling hand, read simply, "The Keeper waits. Fire cannot unmake what has been promised." The collapse of Ashenvale was officially recorded as a tragic accident. A fire sparked during a winter service that consumed the town. Yet the survivors told another story, one that spread in hushed whispers from village to village. Parents warned their children never to stray into the valley. For some swore the ruins still pulsed faintly at night, the embers of something unnatural smoldering beneath the earth. Travelers spoke of finding fresh footprints in the ash, though no living soul remained, and hunters claimed to hear voices when the wind cut through the burned timbers, voices that spoke in that same incomprehensible tongue. Thus the Ashenvale family and their followers perished. Yet their shadow lingered, etched into the land, the air, in the minds of those who dared remember. The valley was abandoned, maps quietly redrawn to erase it, yet it refused to be forgotten. For some nightmares do not end with fire or death, they continue, whispering across centuries, waiting for the moment when the world is weak enough to hear again. Asterisk, the Ashenvale legacy did not end in fire, nor did it find resolution in the courts of men. What followed after the collapse of their household was far more unsettling, because it slipped into the cracks of rumor, superstition, and silence. The land itself seemed to recoil. Farmers abandoned their plots near the Ashenvale estate, claiming that their livestock grew thin and listless, no matter how well they were fed. Hunters whispered that game avoided the wood, leaving a dead hush that blanketed the trees like a shroud. The township of Barrows Hollow shrank as families packed wagons and moved elsewhere, unwilling to raise their children beneath a sky they believed was permanently shadowed by the deeds of the Ash clan. Yet not everything could be erased. Local clerks recorded strange depositions in 1819, when survivors of the last fire spoke of blackened figures moving within the embers. Silent shapes that looked like men but did not burn. Others swore that the voices of the Ashenvale children, who had perished years earlier in the houses earlier, blaze could still be heard echoing across the fields at dusk, calling names, crying, or chanting half-finished prayers. Of course, historians dismiss such stories as fear-driven delusions, the imaginative ramblings of a grief-stricken community. But in the margins of those same official records, one can still read the shaky handwriting of town scribes who admitted they were unsettled by the things they heard with their own ears. The aftermath extended into the archives of neighboring states. In Boston, pamphlets circulated describing the Ashenvale family as an unholy brood, descended into unnatural science. One broadsheet, dated October 1820, claimed that but unearthed upon their land bore signs of surgical tampering, their organs removed or replaced, as if part of some unspeakable trial. The pamphlet was quickly suppressed by magistrates, who worried that such tales would stoke panic. But a few copies survived, preserved by collectors who understood the strange allure of forbidden history. These fragile papers still surface now and again at estate sales, traded in whispers, as if carrying a curse of their own. Then came the stories of the descendants. A handful of surviving Ashenvale relatives, cousins and distant kin, fled westward into the expanding frontier. Some changed their names, but not all escaped suspicion. 1. Jonathan Ashenvale was reportedly tried in Illinois in 1832 for the practice of unlawful medicine upon the dead. Court transcripts note that when the judge questioned him, Jonathan spoke calmly of continuing the sacred work of the family. Words that chilled the chamber into silence. He was acquitted on a technicality, but disappeared soon afterward, vanishing into the forests along the Mississippi. Local legend insists his cabin still stands, though no map dares mark it. More troubling still were the journals recovered from beneath the ruins of the Ashenvale Manor itself. Fire had devoured most of their paper records, but some had been sealed in iron boxes, left charred but intact. These documents told of rituals designed not merely to commune with spirits, but to bend the will of both living and dead toward an unnamed great renewal. Notes described children starved and then revived with tinctures, women treated not as wives or mothers but as vessels, and prayers spoken backward while blood was spilled upon sacred texts. The language grows erratic near the end, as though whoever wrote them had descended into a fever of obsession. The veil is thin. One entry repeats again and again. The veil is thin and soon torn wide. Folklore carried the story farther still. Travelers claimed that the Ashenvale woods became a place where compasses spun aimlessly and shadows bent against the light. Midwives whispered that infants born near the hollow came into the world, already pale and trembling, as though frightened of something only they could see. By the mid-19th century, few dared even speak the family's name aloud. It had become a byword for corruption, a curse muttered in warnings to disobedient children. Do not wander into the trees, lest the Ashenvale take you. And yet, as the decades stretched on, the tale refused to die. In 1871, a traveling preacher from New York claimed in a sermon that he had uncovered a line of secret societies in America, all of which traced their origins back to families like the Ash. He spoke of hidden churches in basements, of rites passed in coded letters, of doctors and ministers alike who carried the black candle of Ashenvale teaching. He was ridiculed by newspapers, dismissed as a fearmonger, and soon disappeared from the public record. Whether his claims were madness or truth remains impossible to say. But perhaps the most disturbing part of this legacy lies not in the ash and ruins of the past, but in what seems to echo into the present. Reports from the 20th century tell of archaeologists, historians, even curious wanderers who set foot near the abandoned hollow only to return change-sickly, withdrawn, or convinced they had seen pale figures moving at the edge of their vision. In 1938, a team of folklorists from Massachusetts collected accounts from old residents who still lived near the land. Their notes describe a widow who claimed to hear children's laughter in the night, a farmer who spoke of cattle bleeding without wounds, and a girl who vanished one autumn evening, never to be found. Officially, the investigation concluded that the family had succumbed to mass hysteria, but unofficially, the team's journals admit to hearing the laughter themselves. Today, the ruins of the Ashenvale estate are gone. Swallowed by time and forest, the land has grown wild, the stones scattered, the pathways reclaimed by moss and root. But those who have visited swear the air grows heavier as one approaches, as though the earth itself resists being disturbed. Some even say the soil there will not bear crops, no matter how rich the seed or season. It is as if the land remembers and refuses to forgive. And so the questions remain unanswered, circling like vultures over a forgotten field. Were the Ashenvales truly seekers of higher knowledge, condemned only because their ambitions overstepped moral boundaries? Or were they puppets of something older, darker, a force that still whispers from beyond the veil they swore they could tear open? Is their story merely a cautionary tale from a superstitious age, or a hidden truth about the hunger that lurks in mankind's pursuit of power? These mysteries linger not because the Ashenvales were exceptional, but because they may not have been exceptional at all. Their story could have been replicated elsewhere, in other families, in other sects, in other institutions that hide behind piety and progress. And if their bloodline truly escaped into the veins of America, who is to say their work did not continue in secret, passed through generations, buried beneath respectable names and polished facades? Perhaps the most chilling legacy of the Ash family is the realization that evil does not die. It adapts, it waits, it waits, and the veil thin as ever may still be torn wide by hands willing to risk everything for the promise of forbidden knowledge. The ruins of the Ashenvale estate stand as a mausoleum to questions that should never be asked. In the stillness of those broken walls, the faint echo of a hymn lingers, as if the stones themselves remember the voices that once filled the night with their desperate cries for salvation. But the true horror of the Ashenvale family is not found only in the bodies left behind, nor in the cult's grotesque rituals. It is in the unanswered questions, in the shadowy corners of history where silence has replaced truth, and in the uneasy feeling that the story is not yet finished. The years following the fire were marked by investigation, rumor, and quiet suppression. Officially, the estate was deemed an accident site. The governor's office issued a short notice, declaring the family and their servants dead in an unfortunate blaze, a phrase as cold as the ashes it described. But the people of Hollow whispered a different story. Some said they saw shapes moving through the smoke the night of the fire, tall figures cloaked in dark robes, carrying something heavy into the forest before the walls collapsed. Others spoke of strange men arriving days later, combing through the rubble and removing boxes of scorched documents and fragments of charred wood, as though they were salvaging secrets rather than relics. And in hushed tones, villagers said these men were not strangers at all, but emissaries of powerful institutions in Boston, or even further, men tied to private societies that wielded more influence than the church or the state itself. Those whispers never faded. By the 1830s, decades after the estate was reduced to ruins, travelers passing through the region reported seeing lights flicker among the trees near the Ashenvale property. A single red glow, they said, would hover in the woods like a lantern, moving deliberately, as though searching for something. Some believed it was nothing more than swamp fire, the natural gas of the earth igniting in trickles of flame. But others swore the lights were carried by the last remnants of the family, those who had escaped the blaze continuing their rituals beneath the cover of night. A farmer named Elias Cotter testified in 1834 that he heard chanting one evening. As he walked his cattle home, he described the voices as layered, unnatural, and harmonized in such a way that it felt less like singing and more like the earth itself was groaning. He fled and never returned to that path. Then there are the journals. In 1842, a young historian named Samuel Winthrop claimed to have uncovered fragments of Elias Ashenvale's writings hidden in a private library in Providence. These journals, he said, contained descriptions of experiments on the human body and the mind attempts to prolong life, to control perception, and to dissolve the boundary between the living and the dead. One entry, dated 1798, allegedly read, "The spirit is not bound by flesh, it is bound by will. We are but caretakers of a flame, and when that flame falters, we must offer it a new vessel. The old shell must be discarded. The fire must endure." Winthrop published portions of these journals in a small pamphlet that circulated briefly among intellectual circles in New England before disappearing. According to records, Winthrop himself vanished shortly thereafter, leaving behind a study littered with burned pages and ink-stained walls. His disappearance only added fuel to the belief that perhaps something was determined to keep the Ashenvale secrets hidden. But if the Ashenvale family truly died that night, why did the sightings continue? By the mid-19th century, stories of encounters had become more violent. A hunter claimed he was stalked for 3 days by figures in black cloaks, their faces concealed behind animal skulls. A group of children exploring the ruins in 1857 reported finding a cellar door intact beneath the rubble, carved with a spiral symbol not unlike the sun etched into old native burial mounds. They described hearing whispers when they touched the door, words in a language they could not understand. By the time villagers returned to investigate, the children's door was gone, as though it had never existed, but the children swore they saw pale hands reaching from the darkness below. The Ashenvale story became more than local folklore, it became a curse. Superstitions spread that anyone who spoke the family's name too often would invite their gaze. Pregnant women were warned not to walk near the estate, lest their unborn be marked by the Ashenvale fire. Sailors in Boston claimed to dream of a burning manor when storms drew near, and preachers in small chapels across New England condemned the family's memory as an abomination against God. Yet despite the warnings, some were drawn to the ruins. Occultists, historians, thrill-seekers, they all came, chasing whispers of forbidden knowledge. Few stayed long. Fewer still returned unchanged. One account, found in the diary of Reverend Michael Talbot in 1861, tells of a secret meeting in which scholars, priests, and judges gathered to discuss the Ashenvale legacy. Talbot wrote that the group debated whether the family had discovered something profound, something that could alter humanity's understanding of life and death. If they had merely descended into madness, the debate ended with no conclusion. But Talbot's final note chills the blood. If they did indeed reach through the veil and call forth what lies beyond, then the question is not whether the Ashenvales perished, but whether they ever truly leapt us. That question lingers still. For if history has taught us anything, it is that the line between devotion and obsession is perilously thin. The Ashenvales claimed to seek light, but they birthed only darkness. They claimed to preserve life, but they invited death to dwell among them. And as we look at the modern world with its institutions cloaked in secrecy, its laboratories pushing the boundaries of what the human body can endure, its organizations promising salvation while demanding blind faith, can we truly say that their story is buried? Or has it simply changed its mask? Think of the societies that operate in shadow, the cults that still thrive in hidden corners of the earth, the experiments whispered of in research facilities funded by governments and private power alike. Are they not heirs to the same hunger that drove the Ashenvales? The hunger to control, to transcend, to dominate both body and spirit. Perhaps the family was not destroyed by fire. Perhaps they were scattered, their knowledge preserved, their rituals adapted to suit the age. And if that is true, then their influence is not confined to the ashes of a burned manor, but alive in the systems we trust, the institutions we serve, the faiths we cling to. So when you hear of a family too powerful to question, or an institution too vast to challenge, ask yourself what fire sustains them, what rituals keep their light burning, and who pays the price for their survival. Because history is not only written in victories and monuments, sometimes it is etched in blood, hidden in shadows, whispered through generations until it finds a new vessel. And maybe, just maybe, the Ashenvale story has already found its way into our present. The ruins of the estate are silent now. But silence does not mean peace. Silence can mean waiting. Waiting for a voice to call it forth again. Waiting for someone curious, desperate, or reckless enough to light the flame anew. And if that day comes, the Ashenvale fire will not be confined to one family or one town. It will spread, consuming everything it touches, until the world itself becomes the vessel. So ask yourself this as you turn away from the story: what keeps you safe? Faith, science, the institutions you trust? Or is safety itself just another illusion? a fragile shell hiding the truth that horror is not confined to the past. That horror waits, patient and silent, ready to take root wherever human ambition outpaces human morality. Perhaps the greatest horror of the Ashenvale family is not what they did, but the reminder of what we are capable of becoming. And that is the tale of the Ashenvales, a family whose name has been half erased, half remembered, but never forgotten. Their history is a wound, a warning, and a whisper. Be careful when you listen too closely to that whisper, because sometimes, when you listen long enough, it listens back.